Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Virtual National Wetlands Award webinar, Community Engagement for the Protection of Wetlands. My name is Chandler Randall, and I am the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's program. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through Zoom's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send us your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar, and while they will be briefly introduced, their full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would really encourage you to check out their expertise in more detail there. But as we begin, I would like to just briefly introduce our opening remarks speaker today, Scott Fulton. Mr. Fulton is president of the Environmental Law Institute, where he previously served as a principal at the environmental law firm Beveridge and Diamond and served as general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. In addition to his role as EPA's general counsel, Mr. Fulton served in a number of other high-ranking leadership roles, including as acting EPA deputy administrator, head of EPA's Office of International Affairs, head of the agency's enforcement program, and a judge on the Environmental Appeals Board. Thank you all so much. And with that, I will turn things over to Scott for his opening remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chandler, and good greetings, everyone. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to this year's National Wetlands Awards. This year marking the 32nd anniversary of this program. Since 1989, this program has recognized over 200 individuals for their contributions to wetlands protection and leadership. This is one of my favorite ELI events, as we have a chance to honor critical acts of leadership aimed at protecting a resource often undervalued, but of enormous importance to ecosystem function, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, nature-based resilience, and environmental justice. It's estimated that the United States has lost more than half of its original wetlands and continues, even in the face of modern understanding of the value of this resource, to lose wetlands at a clip of more than 70,000 acres a year. Alarmingly, the existing distribution of wetlands and other natural areas like streams and forests reflects, among other things, this country's tragic legacy of environmental racism. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are far more likely to live in nature-deprived areas and to be more vulnerable to floods, storm surges, pollution, and other threats to their health and well-being. So for the good of both the natural and human worlds, how wonderful it is that today we recognize exceptional people who are standing in the breach on this issue, bucking the trend, slowing the curve, protecting or reconstituting wetlands acre by acre, and protecting people by doing so. They are leaders not only in their communities, but also nationally, showing us what wetlands conservation really looks like in practice. A few thank yous are in order at the front end of this event for the organizers and supporters of the awards program. We want to thank the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for their unwavering support for and participation in this year's National Wetlands Awards. Many thanks as well to our distinguished award selection committee. The selection process for these awards is very seriously undertaken, and the results are the product of a lot of hard work on their part. Thanks as well to ELI's project manager for this event, Rebecca Kisslinger, who none of this really could happen without her diligence and hard work, and the hard work as well of the other ELI staff who are present with us today or have worked on the program. Catherine Salinas, Rachel Jean-Baptiste, Colin Gibson Tanzel, Dominic Schicitano, Matt Mitchell, and Sayla Goodson Bell. And finally, thanks most of all, and congratulations to this year's awardees. So let's hear about them now. Our first award is for youth leadership and goes to Sonia Michaluk. This award is given to a wetlands champion under the age of 21, whose work demonstrates a strong dedication to protecting wetlands. At age 17, Sonia has already made amazing contributions to this field of work as a research scientist, writer, environmental educator, and a founder of a genetics and microbiology lab. She is already recognized for making environmental discoveries and changes in the state of New Jersey and around the world. Sonia, who is an advocate for data-driven environmental decision-making, has been a certified water monitor since she was 6 years old and has advocated on behalf of wetlands since she was 11. Between 2014 and 2020, Sonia contributed to the preservation of over 50 acres of ecologically sensitive wetlands and wildlife corridors in New Jersey by collecting and analyzing field data, working with state and local governments, and speaking at public hearings. Before the pandemic, Sonia was flown to Sweden to represent the United States at World Water Week and at a climate change symposium there. Her research, which has been recognized internationally, has been published in Encyclopedia Britannica, presented at numerous conferences, and featured in films about climate change and the environment. So many thanks for your efforts and congratulations on your award, Sonia. Our next award is for promoting awareness, and it goes to Xavier Cortada. This award is presented to an educator, volunteer, NGO staffer, or other individual whose direct activities inspire others to engage in wetlands protection and provide them with the tools to do so through knowledge sharing, outreach, or advocacy. Xavier is an artist and a professor of practice in the University of Miami's Department of Art and Art History. For 15 years, he has creatively harnessed the power of art to motivate fellow Miami-Dade County residents, 65% of whom are Latino, to learn about, conserve, and restore mangrove wetlands. What began as a childhood fascination with mangroves' strangely shaped roots and structure evolved into a socially engaged art practice, extolling mangroves' value to the local ecosystem. Xavier created highly innovative eco-art projects to mobilize Miamians to care for and restore mangroves. This includes a community-driven reclamation project tied to county-wide public and private school educational programming, a volunteering project encouraging neighbors to build up climate change resiliency by growing salt-tolerant mangroves in their yards, and the nation's first underwater homeowners association to address the threat of rising seas and saltwater intrusion into their freshwater aquifer. So many thanks for your innovations and your efforts, Xavier, and congratulations on your award. Our next award is for business leadership, and it goes to Russell or Russ Fernari. This award is given to an individual who, through the course of their work in the private sector, has made substantial contributions to wetland sustainability as part of a corporate responsibility initiative or through their business practices. Russ is the manager of environmental policy enterprise for the Public Service Enterprise Group, or PSEG, a Fortune 500 company that has been named to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for North America for 13 consecutive years. Since 2006, Russ has shared as chairman of the New Jersey Corporate Wetlands Restoration Partnership, a unique public-private collaborative aimed at restoring, preserving, enhancing, and protecting aquatic habitats throughout New Jersey. Through Russ's strong leadership and commitment, the New Jersey chapter has experienced phenomenal success and is now considered a model for similar groups across the nation. Membership and annual funds raised to support restoration projects are at an all-time high. One such project is the Upper Wallkill Watershed Riparian Restoration and Floodplain Reforestation Initiative. With the help of 200 students, the first phase resulted in the restoration of 4.5 acres of wetlands, and the initiative has the potential to restore more than 60 acres by the completion of the entire project. Many thanks for your efforts, Russ, and congratulations on your award. Our next award is for local stewardship, and it goes to Winley Ferguson. This award is presented to a landowner, community member, local NGO staffer, or local government official or other official who voluntarily helps restore, protect, or minimize impacts to their local wetlands through actions taken either on their own property or on wetlands owned by others. Winley has spent the last 31 years working for Save the Bay in Providence, Rhode Island, where she now serves as Director of Habitat Restoration. Throughout her career, she's partnered with federal, state, and local entities to advance projects that restore and enhance coastal and estuarine habitats and improve community resilience, working tirelessly to bring them from conception to implementation and adaptive management. Winley has been a leader in identifying and assessing climate change impacts to coastal wetlands within Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts, and advancing new and emerging restoration and management approaches in the southern New England region. She has also led volunteer teams to engage local communities and advocates on the importance of conserving marsh migration corridors. Winley also collaborates with local researchers and has contributed to several peer-reviewed publications relating to coastal marsh conditions and restorations. So many thanks to you as well, Winley, and congratulations on your award. Our final award in this year's award suite is the Award for Wetlands Program Development, and it goes to Lauren Driscoll. This award is given to a state, local, or tribal authority official who has developed and administered an outstanding wetlands program. Lauren Driscoll's commitment to wetland conservation and restoration has been unwavering for more than 25 years. She has worked tirelessly to not only strengthen the efficacy and efficiency of wetlands protection in her own state of Washington, but has also engaged in national planning and decision-making. Lauren has managed the wetlands program at the Washington State Department of Ecology since 2005, where she ensures statewide consistency in the implementation of Clean Water Act Section 401 water quality certifications for wetlands and provides expert technical assistance and guidance for local wetland regulations. She mentors wetland technical staff statewide, provides oversight for Washington's wetland compliance and wetland banking programs, and secures grants for wetland program activities. Lauren's expertise in wetland policy and mitigation has deeply strengthened this state's work in these areas. Lauren also oversaw the development of Washington's first EPA-approved wetland program plan, a 6-year plan that formalizes program development for the state. So many thanks to you, Lauren, for your efforts, and congratulations to you on your award. So congratulations once more to all of our awardees. We celebrate your work. We value it tremendously and are inspired by your amazing examples. So with that, let's move into our program for today. Our moderator for today's program is ELI's own wetlands champion, Rebecca Kinslinger. Becky is our resident PhD scientist and is director of ELI's wetlands program, and is one of our key leaders in building resilience for a sustainable future. So please, Becky, over to you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really, truly inspiring stories, inspiring people, and congratulations again to all of our winners. We're really happy to honor you through this program, through ELI's National Wetlands Awards program. So thanks, Scott. So on to our program. As Scott said, my name is Rebecca Kinslinger. I'm a senior science and policy analyst at ELI. I direct our wetlands program. Chandler, you can change to the next slide. ELI's wetlands program provides timely, balanced information on wetlands law, policy, management, and science through research, education, and convening, and programs like the National Wetlands Awards. We have lots of information on our website, archived reports, archived webinars. You can find there eli.org/wetlands-program. You can also sign up for our mailing list there if you want to learn more about what we do. Okay, you can switch to the next slide, Chandler. So on to our program, and speaking of really inspiring stories and work, we're going to talk today about community engagement for the protection of wetlands, and we have just a really stellar panel, including one of our National Wetlands Awards winners this year. They're going to talk about the work they're doing to empower environmental justice communities to engage in and shape wetland protection efforts to address the disproportionate impacts that Scott talked about that often fall to these communities during and in the aftermath of natural disasters, as well as the impacts to climate change. So we're going to kick off our panel today with Louis Rivers. He's an associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at NC State University, North Carolina State University. His research focuses on the examination of risk and judgment and decision process in minority and marginalized communities, particularly in regards to natural environment and issues of environmental justice. He's going to start off the webinar today with a broad discussion of environmental justice, and he's going to talk about some of the work he's doing on wetland habitats in his area in Raleigh. We're going to then move on to Kathy Eglund. Kathy is the program director and co-founder of Economics, Environment, and Climate and Health Organization. She's a native of Gulfport, Mississippi, and has been active in the local and global community in addressing climate change and environmental injustice. Kathy chairs the Environment and Climate Justice Committee for the National Board of Directors of the NAACP. Her committee is in charge of governance responsibility of raising awareness of environmental and climate issues from a civil rights, social justice, and equity perspective. We're really happy to have you here today, Kathy. And then finally, we're going to finish up our panel today with Xavier Cortada. You just heard a lot about his really inspiring and great work in Miami. He's going to talk more in depth about 3 of his projects, ongoing projects that he's been working on. So we're going to move on to our panel. We're going to start with Louis.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. So I'm going to talk a little about environmental justice today. I really want to provide a frame for the next 2 speakers who have done really amazing work. So this idea of wetland protection and how often it is involving, ideas around environmental justice. So next slide. So what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And just to go back to our opening talk, this is directly from the EPA, and I think the EPA has done a really good job of kind of really developing how we think about environmental justice in terms of regulation and protection of the environment. Next slide. And there are really 2 main facets to environmental justice. So I think there's the first facet, which we often think about, this idea of everyone deserves the same degree of protection from environmental hazards. And that's incredibly important. And I think that's often the first thing that we think about. But also what is equally important is the idea that everyone has access to decision-making process to live in a healthy environment, to live and work. So like, you know, it's this, not only do you have protection from these hazards, but you also have access to helping make decisions around those hazards. And you also have access to the better parts of the environment. So like, you know, there are a lot of great things in our natural environment. So not only should we all be protected from the environmental harms, we also have access to environmental goods. Next slide. So when we think about environmental justice from an academic perspective, and I apologize in advance if I get too wonky, I'll try to avoid that. There's really 3 different ways that we try to operationalize this idea to kind of make it real. And that's this idea of recognition, procedure, and distribution. So I want to talk about these 3 concepts and really highlight just a little bit of the work of the other panelists who have done amazing work throughout their careers. But they really help to highlight these different aspects of environmental justice. So next slide. So often we think, from an academic perspective, this first step in environmental justice is this idea of recognition. And this operates in multiple ways. A, we need to recognize the frontline communities that are being exposed disproportionately to environmental harms. And often these same frontline communities don't have access to the goods in the environment. They don't have access to parks that they can walk to. They also may not have access to clean drinking water or clean air to breathe. So, you know, we need to recognize these communities, and that's a big part of recognition. Another part of recognition is raising awareness in these communities about their connection to the environment, and also and what I think is more important, raising the awareness of adjacent communities who are often more affluent and how the decisions that they make can impact these frontline communities. So like, you know, this idea of recognition is a really big part of Xavier Cortado's work with his artwork. And he's raising awareness through different communities, but he's also helping people recognize their connection to the environment and how the decisions that they make not only impacts them, but also other people. And also often impacts people in communities that are less affluent than yours. Next slide. So once we think about this recognition process, making sure we recognize frontline communities, recognize people who are being impacted by environmental justice issues, the next part that we think about is procedure. And that's the idea that we really want to make sure that these communities have a voice in how we think about making decisions around the environment. And, you know, part of that can be when we look at Xavier's work, again, talk about Xavier, is to talk about, you know, raising this recognition and helping people become part of this dialogue about the environment through art, which is really a creative way to invite people into this dialogue about talking about deliberations around making management decisions for the natural environment, especially the local environment. And there's also the work that Catherine Eglin has also engaged in, this idea of, you know, making sure people have a chance to voice what is going on in their communities with different hazards that they may not want there, and they often don't want there. And when we often think about procedure, I think we think about comment periods or very legal, formalistic ways that we deal with the environment. But also protesting is a part of procedure. It's another way of including people's voices in how we make decisions around the environment. So that's incredibly important to think about. Next slide. And that really goes to this final thing. So yes, we need to recognize these communities, which is incredibly important. We need to make sure that these communities have a voice in how their local environment is managed and that we recognize that voice. But at the end of the day, what I think is most important is that we change the distribution. We can have great recognition and we can have great procedure, but if we still have these same frontline communities experiencing most of the harm, what's the point? So, you know, that really brings me to just like a fraction of the work that Kathy has done around, you know, really leading this change for getting the Jack Watson electric generating plant to go from coal to natural gas, you know, a much cleaner burning gas, which is much better for the air quality for that local community. And that's exactly what we want. We don't want to go through this process of recognizing communities and involving their voices and still not having tangible change on ground. So it's really important that we have this change actually happening on ground. So before, I don't want to go too long, but before, I also wanted to touch on this idea of community engagement and what's really important for doing, successful community engagement. Can we go to the next slide? So when we think about engagement from an academic perspective, there's really two types of engagement. There's this generation of new knowledge, which you can do with partner, and then there's this idea of addressing management issues. And often the critique that we get in the academy, and I think you can also, to some extent, level this critique at the government, is that we're trying to generate new knowledge, which is really important, but it may not have a distinct impact on local communities, and especially not immediately. So I think when we think about engagement communities, especially in an environmental justice framework, next slide, we really want to think about how can we better address management issues, and how can we make the communities not only participants in this work, but also partners in helping us to address this work. Next slide. And I'm gonna age myself, but this really makes me think about this song from Big Daddy Kane, Ain't No Half Steppin'. Next slide. When you do this work with communities, you can't half step, you can't half do community engagement. It's a long-term process that you have to be truly committed to. And I think we see that in the two other panelists and all the people who won awards today. I think what we see, a big part of what they're doing is that they have a true engagement, they have a true commitment to engaging with their community in a long-term process and engaging with this idea of wetland protection. This isn't something you come and do quickly or overnight. It's a long-term commitment. And there's some keys to engaging with the community. First, you need to be respectful. Too often, we do not treat the community as equals, and we fail to recognize that often frontline community members have knowledge that we have no idea about. So we may have different metrics for measuring that knowledge, but it's important to realize that they know things that we do not know, and sometimes they know things that we don't know how to measure. So it's important that we're respectful when we engage with the community, and when we do that engagement, it's important that it's done with humility. As I alluded to before, it's commitment. Working with the community is a long-term investment. It's not something that can be done quickly. And then finally, there needs to be honesty when you engage with the community. And this means that if you're gonna bring a community into a decision-making process, you need to be clear about how much access they really will have to power. Are they really gonna have access to real decision-making power? If they say no to this project, will their no stand? So I think it's important that we're honest and clear with communities when we seek to engage with them around environmental justice issues. Next slide. And underlying all of this, and I would argue underlying a lot of the processes of environmental justice and engagement with community is this idea of trust. So I think we all know what trust is, but again, a technical definition, a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. And when we engage with communities, what we need is a symmetrical trust. Too often, the trust, we have asymmetrical trust, where we're just asked to trust in a regulator, we're asked to trust in a government. When you do community engagement, you want the community to have trust in you, but also you need to have trust in the community. Because if you don't have that trust, you're less likely to give them actual real power and to really invite them into the decision-making process. Next slide. So I would just want to close. Originally, I thought I'd talk about my own work, but I read up on the other people on the panels, and I realized that they would be a perfect way to kind of highlight what we're talking about here. And I just want to say that, there are templates of how you can think about environmental justice, engaging in these different aspects of environmental justice, whether it be recognition, procedure, or distribution, and really doing it in a sustainable way through really true, honest community engagement. So Again, thank you for giving me a chance to kind of set up what we're talking about today, and I'll be glad to take any questions later.
Thank you so much for that. That was really great. I loved ain't no half stepping cues. I think we all need to be reminded of that in all of our work, and that's really, truly important. So thank you for presenting those. Kathy, on to you. That was a really great intro.
Yes, thank you so much. It really was a very great intro. Ain't no half stepping, because on my next slide, when we talk about our regulatory agencies, you know, when I just laughed when I saw that ain't no half stepping, because yeah, I feel like our regulatory agencies are half stepping. Next slide, we have these all these laws in place that are supposed to protect wetlands, yet communities are constantly under siege, and we're always having to devote so much time and energy still into protecting our wetlands. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about Turkey Creek and the Turkey Creek wetlands. This is a case history, and I don't know how many of you have heard about Turkey Creek, Mississippi. It's a very small community that fewer than 100 residents, sorry, fewer than 400 residents, probably fewer than that now. And just tremendous story. On the next slide. Well, before we go to that next slide, well, that's fine, just stay there. We have this story. If you have not seen this story, Come Hell or High Water, the battle for Turkey Creek, it is something that you should really look at. It's a great award-winning documentary, and it focuses around the story of Derek Johnson and Rose Derek Evans, I'm sorry, and Rose Johnson. So that's an error on there. That should be Derek Evans and Rose Johnson, who championed the Turkey Creek watershed and wetlands. And this story kind of came about after a former mayor who is now deceased, former mayor of Gulfport, called the community a bunch of dumb bastards because they were objecting to a proposed development. And so you'll see there in the middle at the top, that photo, that's a photo of Turkey Creek before what was supposed to be or used as guise of desnagging the creek. However, they went in and just totally demolished the area, as you can see in the photo underneath. Graves were desecrated. I mean, it was an absolute mess. And the NAACP, Sierra Club, and several other organizations came together and filed a lawsuit against the city. Next slide, on the next slide. Here's Derek Evans and Rose Johnson again. And down below, you'll see how the community is reclaiming and restoring historical landmarks in the area. One thing, unfortunately, the struggle continues, even though all of this situation happened almost 20 years ago. We're still facing, this community is still facing problems, still having to deal with trying to protect the wetlands, trying to protect the communities. And one of the first things that we did, and Louis mentioned, sometimes we're involved in so many struggles that you forget about some, and you forget about those victories, such as Plant Jack Watson. But next slide, on the next slide, just as Plant Watson, we started that campaign with an educational series, with a series of education. We had a full day educational workshop where Jackie Patterson, who is the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Senior Director, came down. We had members of the communities come out, and we did a full day workshop on what was happening at the Plant Watson, because people just were not aware. After we had a series of trainings, then we had a series of town hall meetings. So we wanted to do this same thing as it relates to our wetlands. And so we had a series of town hall meetings or town hall lecture. There were dinner lecture series. We had them during the day for a local high school that we partner with, and we had them in the evening for the community so that it would be more accessible. However, if community members wanted to attend the school events during the day, they had that option as well. But we wanted to make it as accessible for everyone as possible. And this was a great partnership, these science lecture series, and one that we wanted to duplicate in 2020. However, then came COVID. So on our next slide, you'll see here, these are some photos where the local news did a story on taking these students into out of the class and into nature. And that was so rewarding because to hear some of those students, and this was the botany class, usually the high school students or the high school principal welcome anything that we bring to them. They welcome it. And classes, it's almost like a reward for the students because different classes are selected to attend these events. And this happens to be the botany class at Gulfport High School. And to hear students say that they learn more in that one day than they did in an entire year is very, very reaffirming. And on the next slide, you'll see this was a trip to Turkey Creek Wetlands. For the students, we had it the day before on a Friday. And for the adults, we had it on a Saturday, the following day. And just like the students, whenever I think the big thrill whenever adults go to these wetlands and students is to see the pitcher plant or the carnivorous plants. And it's always, some of these residents actually live adjacent to the wetlands and they didn't understand an awful lot about them. So the educational trip, scientists learn a lot, as Louis mentioned. Scientists learn a lot from the community and the community learn an awful lot from the scientists. And on the next slide, you will see where, once again, and you would think that when you have laws in place, that the community would not have to spend so much time trying to fight back against wetland proposals that will harm communities. So once again, this photo is on the left is the site of a former fertilizer plant where there is a 24-hour military staging operation being proposed in the heart of a historic African-American neighborhood. And on the left, this shows how this will impact Turkey Creek. I'm sorry, that's on the right. It shows how the impact that it will have on Turkey Creek. Again, you would think that with laws in place that there would be some protection, but we have found that the Corps of Engineers and our permitting agencies will allow the development of these wetlands, and the community have to go out, find attorneys. Fortunately, we were able to find a pro bono attorney on this. After it was permitted, we actually had a hearing about 3 weeks ago, and MDEQ decided that they were right, and they would, when you do this appeal, you're appealing to them to reverse their decision, which of course they did not. And on the next slide, if that were not enough, that we were looking at that particular proposal while we were in the midst of that proposal, we had another proposal to come up where Gulfport wants to build new roads. This is going to adversely impact the wetlands. It's going to destroy hundreds of acres of wetlands. Now, this story just continues because the Come Hell or High Water talks about the developer's father. So now we're in the second generation of this struggle, where the developer's son is now proposing to develop this area. The Bill Grant, which is what this proposal is called, that where they want to build the highway to ease traffic congestion. And now you have the current mayor, whose father was on the city council when during the first proposal. So now we're in the second phase of this, the same thing all over again. The current developer, this generation developer, has donated, and I say that very lightly, quote unquote, donated, they say $4 million of land, as if it was generosity and out of the goodness of his heart, when he will get back more than 400 times that investment of property. On the next slide, not only do we have just in this area and as it relates to developments, but we're looking at something on, and I do a lot of work, and I can see this local to global connection. You're also looking at where our MDEQ has approved the permitting of yet another plant. This wood pellet manufacturing plant will be the largest in the world, yet it is being permitted as a low source emission. We warn and we campaign against having this plant. Not only are they decimating our forests and wetlands, but they are poisoning our communities in the process and shipping the finished products. The manufacturing is one of the most toxic ever. And they are manufacturing these wood pellets where they release carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere immediately when these trees are cut. And then they tightly compress the trees into these small pellets. And then they ship them overseas to countries in the EU mostly, and mostly in the UK. On the left side, you see a plant here where at a trailer park, and you see these children outside playing. Now, this plant, and we warned MDEQ about this before they permitted the in vivo.
I think we may have lost Kathy there.
I'm
for a
sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes. I don't know if
Okay, I'm
anyone else was
sorry.
experiencing issues there.
Okay, so we have the Gloucester, Mississippi plant where we warned MDEQ about the tendency of these industries to go into communities, pollute them. They'll claim to be low source of emission. That's to get under or to skirt the Clean Air Act. And then they come in and pollute the areas. Now, the Drax Emit plant in Gloucester, Mississippi was fined, and you know, they're saying it's the largest fine ever. They were fined $2.5 million. However, this was after 8 years of pollution. And to put that in perspective, $2.5 million is about what they make in one day. So that basically amounts to a corporate timeout. And that's something we really need to look into from a federal level as well, because EPA under the previous administration actually listed biomass as a renewable source of energy along with wind and solar, and nothing could be further from the truth. We have scientists who have written to the European Parliament, as well as to our Congress, advising against and warning against the use of biomass. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about, we've talked about a lot of the problems. We're going to talk about some of the opportunities. It gave us so much hope to see that DOT halted this Texas highway project in Houston. Now, we had already filed a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights with DOT. We filed a complaint with HUD simply because the highway project in Gulfport will pose harm and flood risk to a historical HUD project. It was a joint venture with the National Council of Negro Women and HUD, and it was supported by the Ford Foundation, and that's called the Forest Heights subdivision. So if you will Google that, it has a very, very rich history. And we're looking at hopefully this new administration who has said that they would prioritize environmental justice. And this project, the Houston project, was halted, citing violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we're hoping that this will impact the Gulfport, Mississippi highway project. We also have an opportunity here for the first time ever, having this White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We also, one good thing and one thing that we're really proud about is the Wetlands Restoration Project here on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in the Turkey Creek area with funds from the BP oil spill. We also opportunities, community education, community and school partnerships, community strategic plan, because that was one of the things that the Turkey Creek community did. Instead of just being reactive all the time, there is a community strategic plan in place. This plan was developed about 10 years ago. Our city officials, our local and state officials continue to not pay much attention to these plans. Some people look at the Turkey Creek wetlands as a drainage, basically a dumping ground, and still did not recognize it. Turkey Creek was recently named one of the most endangered rivers in the nation, and that was by the American Rivers. So it continues to be a struggle, but we do have a plan, and we are hoping, I don't like to keep the same battle. We should not be looking at fighting this same battle we're in the next generation. This should cease and desist. So we're looking at hopefully working along with our government, because we're not going to give up. We're going to continue this. Now it looks as if hopefully we have a pro bono attorney for our case against DOT. And we've already been in contact with the Office of Civil Rights. So the struggle continues. It will continue, because we will do whatever we can, and we're going to always stand, and we're not going to half step when it comes to protecting our wetlands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you for detailing all that, the threats, but also the opportunities. And thank you for being there for your community. You're not going to give up, I know it. So thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I wanted to remind everyone that please go ahead and type your questions if you have any for our panelists. You can do that now. We'll get to those after the final presentation, but feel free to do that while they're on your mind. And you can type those into the Q&A box on the platform. So we're going to move on next to Xavier Cortada.
Great, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. Chandler, you're going to be helping me out a little bit with this. What I'm going to ask you to do is every 10 seconds or so, after this initial slide, I'll just have you press a slide for me every 10 seconds or so. First of all, I want to thank ELI for bestowing this incredible honor on me, and specifically to Honoring the Future, a wonderful nonprofit that I collaborate with in educating our future, for nominating me. Louie and Kathy, what a great honor for me to share this moment here with you and learning from you. I honor the work you've done, Kathy, at the ground level, the work you've done in community, with community, to effectuate meaningful, positive, lasting change. And as you just explained, the struggle continues, and it's going to continue, which means we have to create a cadre of engaged, science literate citizens to continue the fight. And in many ways, what I do, Louis, and I'm so glad that you put this environmental justice perspective as a way of framing this entire conversation, is do just that. I care passionately about mangroves. My dad would walk with me on the beaches of Biscayne Bay and talk about these plants that were in his native fishing village in the northern coast of Cuba. And we were able to connect across the Florida Straits, across generations and across times with mangroves. And to be able to continue those conversations is important to me. I do so through participatory eco art projects, and the Underwater Homeowners Association is something I did in 2018 in response to the existential threat that Miami faces. Sea level rise is real, and unlike hurricanes, the water won't recede. This here is not Antarctica, that is Miami. I work with that group at the McMurdo station. It's the dry valleys in McMurdo in Antarctica. The sediment that you see there at the left of that frozen lake that is melting with rising temperatures is what I used to create these Antarctic ice paintings, where I melted glaciers that scientists gave me and sediment of Antarctica in Antarctica, informed by the science of Antarctica, as a precursor of the horrors to come, the horrors that would befall Miami as those glaciers melted and literally brought it to our shorelines. And that is the catastrophe that we are facing in real time here in Miami. I'll say next, Chandler, thank you. So this is what happens when Antarctica comes to town. As you can see, a huge swath of beloved wetlands, the Florida Everglades, and all of coastal Miami will be irreparably damaged with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into our aquifer. So what I did, and of course, thousands, hundreds of thousands of my fellow citizens will suffer. Those with least wealth will suffer the most because they don't have the means to leave or to try to problem solve their way out of the issue. So back in 2007, when the National Science Foundation took me to Antarctica, I created these ice paintings. Next. So keep it every 10 seconds and we'll be good. I created these ice paintings to depict the horrors to come. And they were simply just the very ice that threatens to melt Miami. It was a conceptual art piece, but one that I use as a conceptual painting to communicate ideas. And I took these ideas everywhere. I took them to literally the leaders of two coastal states then in 2007, California and Florida, as a way of admonishing them to continue the work to help protect our communities from sea level rise. But in 2018, I wanted to take that a step further, and I actually engaged my neighbors in Miami so that they could understand that this is the future that Miami saw. Just hold it for a second here, Chandler. What you see in white there is a ridge. It's if you can imagine the Florida Keys, Miami has a section of Miami that's at higher ground, but then it goes back down and into the Everglades. So at less than 7 feet, this is what Miami looks like. Next. So I wanted to map the topography of our community so people understand literally what their elevation was and where they stood by creating these markers that people would put in their front homes, just like they would put a for sale sign. Over here, they were putting a sign that let others know what elevation they stood, how much Antarctic glacier had to melt before their sea level rose to that number, 8 feet, would determine when that house would be underwater. But the important part of this issue isn't that that person did it, but that through this campaign, they engaged in conversations with one another, understanding that Antarctica didn't care if you were a Republican or a Democrat, the same way science doesn't care if you believe it or not. It's real and it's what is. Over here, neighbors worked with neighbors to understand that it wasn't a political sign. It wasn't definitely a partisan sign. It was a sign to ground them in a campaign to figure out what would happen even before water rose to 6 feet. What would happen with their septic tanks, with their flood insurance, with their property values, and specifically, what would happen in those communities that had the most to lose. So I took students from high schools from across my entire county, from the northernmost school all the way down to Homestead, and they mapped the topography on intersections across an east to west roadway, showing what the elevation was. And what people discovered as they were driving through flat Miami is that, yes, at the coast it's lower, and then it goes up as you would expect it to be, but then suddenly out towards the west, where properties are of lower value, it went back down again. So that was my way of helping explain, visualize, understand that it was in their best interest to do something about solving this problem. And it's something that was a bit controversial, I'll be honest with you, when we created it, but it created that important dialogue. It created what Louis called that recognition. But I also created these procedures by creating homeowner association, where they would come together and advocate and write letters to the Army Corps of Engineers, write letters to members of the legislative bodies, and learn and work together as to what solutions they could come up with to try to problem solve. So that was the work of the Underwater Homeowners Association. And this is what we call a socially engaged art piece. It starts by using something that's a little bit strange, like this weird yard sign with a number on it, as a way, as a catalyst to engage individuals in conversation about making it something impossible to ignore. Those conversations lead to relationships that take time. We have been meeting as an underwater HOA through COVID every day since the 9th of January, where our current mayor, then a commissioner, swore us all into office in January 9 of 2019. And we will continue meeting indefinitely because this problem isn't going away. There's one example of what we do as a group, and then we iterate, we move on. So when the elections happened last November, at the University of Miami, we created an installation with signs asking people not to vote thinking about 2-year timelines, but to think of what their lives and their property would be years from now, 30 years from now, to vote thinking about sea level rise as opposed to thinking about a politician's charm or a politician's ideas for the next election cycle. All of this started with the Reclamation Project, something that my team is so happily celebrating. My team is a studio, an art studio. After 15 years of doing this work voluntarily, right? This is not like a nonprofit organization. This is an artist who works with PTAs and volunteers to help effectuate meaningful positive change. And over here, is where it all started. It actually started 2 years earlier in 2004 under this dingy highway smack in the middle of downtown Miami. And I was asked to, as an artist, to beautify that highway, to create murals for it. And I thought about my parents and about their journey as immigrants and what their lives were like as they slowly tried to integrate themselves into what quite candidly was a nation that welcomed them with open arms, but neighborhoods that discriminated against them and did not feel as welcoming. And I thought of a mangrove seedling coming across the water and landing on a sandbar and setting its roots, and how by setting roots, it nurtured itself. By reaching out, it became stronger. And I imagined all these other mangroves, all these other families, all these other immigrants creating community in these enclaves in Miami, as has happened since the beginning of this town. And how that would create a powerful mangrove forest, a resilient mangrove forest that would protect us from the strength of the energy that a hurricane brings with storm surge. It would create this buffer, a strong, integrated, interwoven, interconnected community would provide that. And then as that happened during that 2-year period, I thought about not the displacement of immigrants alone, but the actual displacement of mangroves. Because in Miami Beach, where this photo was taken at a chlorinated pool, is about the only place where this mangrove could be, and maybe not, right? Because everything in Miami have been paved over. What used to be wetlands was now a restaurant in the middle of Lincoln Road Mall, an open air mall where hundreds of thousands of tourists visit every year. What would have been a natural place for these mangroves to have habitats among roseate spoonbills and crocodiles were now filled with asphalt and concrete and neon and even swimming pools, but no natural habitat. In fact, because we barricaded the island with seawalls and our entire bay with seawalls, there was no place for a mangrove to naturally set its roots because they need a grade to set their roots. So I brought a bunch of volunteers together, starting with the PTA leader of a local school. I asked her to bring her PTA friends and just join me in collecting mangrove seedlings. And we started planting those mangrove seedlings. Well, first of all, we collected them, and it's important. I saw Kathy do this too. Take them into a mangrove forest. Understand the beauty, the pristine beauty of a mangrove forest, the way the light filters, the ecosystem services it provides, to smell it, to live it, to breathe it, to be immersed in the beauty of nature. So that was one step of the process, bringing those volunteers in. They collected mangrove propagules, and those mangrove propagules would be what they would use to create vertical nurseries across their community. We specifically started with South Beach, big area of tourists and high visibility. So the next slide, Chadler. And what we did is we created these vertical nurseries that were arranged in a special way. They were arranged as rows and columns. The rows would represent streets, the columns would represent avenues. And the idea was that this was the built environment made with cups and clips and suction cups. But in that grid, in that city grid, we would bring nature. We would bring this organic mangrove propagule. And they had to be clear cups because I wanted people to understand and fall in love with mangroves the way I did. You could literally see their roots grow through time and then their leaves sprout. And this was something we did in full sight on the most populated area, the most trafficked street in Miami-Dade County, Lincoln Road in South Beach, Miami Beach. And they would stand there for months as these reminders of what was once there. And my volunteers literally worked with the people putting it together by asking the barista at Starbucks if they could create the installation, by asking the manager. So all of a sudden, the people I had taken into the forest were now the eco-emissaries who they themselves were campaigning for the creation of these vertical nurseries to raise awareness more than anything else, because we could have just done this at a regular nursery, but we wanted to do it smack where a mangrove forest was. In time, the Science Museum was interested in the work we did, and they created these vertical nurseries at their museum. And then through them, we started reaching out to schools and communities, public schools, private schools. And at the end, everyone from our first time doing it to our work with the Science Museum and to our work today would take those mangroves and we would plant them in areas along our bay that had been made available to us for replantings. And again, a lot of this work was done in collaboration with the Department of Durham here in our county and with the Science Museum. What we wanted to do was create new ecosystems above and below the water line, but more importantly, wanted to have people engaged as environmental stewards who knew that this wasn't government's issue, even though we care passionately about systemic change and governmental regulations, but it was theirs because they're the ones who need to be activated to demand, to get their needs met so they could all have a better future. And we would always put a green flag to reclaim the land for nature, almost like a reverse conquistador saying, this land belongs to future generations and the animals we coexisted with. So this was my public art project. It wasn't made with green pigment. It was made with chlorophyll and beautiful structures that the mangrove roots created. That was a project specifically designed for coastal areas to help regrow our coastal habitats. Mangroves, they're endemic only to us in South Florida, They haven't gone to the other states, but in time with global climate change, that boundary continues creeping northward. This led me, and the fact that sea level rise was happening led me to understand that I needed to do something a little bit different. So after I created my Underwater Homeowners Association and understood that the places that we had planted acres of mangroves on would eventually be submerged, I created Plant to take those same mangroves, but plant them in higher ground so that they would have a canopy in the future seed stock for a community that's literally enduring sea level rise. So again, in 2019, my volunteers went to mangrove forest. They were immersed in mangrove forest, and they were collecting mangrove propagules that clearly returned to their special place, just like my exhibit at the UM Gallery is today, on a grid, on a wall, as a modernist grid, as a piece of art, as a way of having folks understand that the art piece is right here in front of you. It's the growth of these 400 some individual mangroves before you, for you to look at them the same way you would look at a textured painting. But because of human impacts on climate, because we continue living the hottest summers on record year after year after year, because that causes our polar caps, Greenland, Antarctica, to melt and our sea ice to thaw, leaving even a feedback loop that furthers this problem, creating warmer oceans that create stronger, hello Maria, slower, hello Dorian, wetter, hello Harvey, hurricanes. Because of the impacts of human on the climate, not just with the bulldoze like happened to all of Miami's mangroves along the inner bay, but now by the impact caused by fossil fuels and the addiction to fuel that this country still hasn't been able to kick. Our mangroves were no longer safe because the same sea level rise that would threaten our built spaces would also threaten these mangrove forests. So I started this campaign to literally plant these mangroves across the community and letting Miami understand that we have three coastlines: the east, obviously, the west, the Everglades, you know, that river of grass will soon be a sea of salt water, and of course the water beneath our feet, the aquifer, that before those two things happen, the aquifer will have saltwater intrusion. That's happening today. Our wells in Miami-Dade County are now west of where they were before, because salt water keeps on soaking, intruding in there. So the idea of having our community understand that was the premise of the Plant Project. And what I did is I asked volunteers to plant a mangrove propagule, not at the water's edge, but in their front yard. And next to it, plant a flag with their elevation on it. We did the same process again. We installed them in schools. We actually installed them in every single Miami-Dade County branch of Dade County libraries. We had 45 mangrove installations with programming that my students at the University of Miami did as volunteers. They went out and they gave lectures to the community. They had them use an app, see what their elevation was across all of Miami-Dade County, every neighborhood across Miami-Dade County. People mapped their topography, they were able to see, and then they were given white flags that they put a number on and planted a mangrove next to it. And the idea is that as this mangrove grows, time happens and their vulnerability to sea level rise also grows. So here you have the audacity to do this, to let the world know that you are in trouble, but that gives you the courage to charge on and to continue your work in protecting your community. Eventually, there will be no Miami. I know that's hard to hear, but that is true. And what we are doing is trying to have a retreat where there's enough of a seed stock enough mangroves planted inland so that that process is one that is a little bit more graceful and respects the organisms and the carbon sequestration that needs to happen as time moves forward. Again, what I care most about is about creating a cadre of engaged citizens, and I use my socially engaged art to ensure that those citizens don't get duped, that they understand the consequences of actions, and that when someone tries to persuade them that this is a good idea, I hear you loudly, Kathy, about being called bastards, right? I hear you loudly. I want smart individuals that can take that and turn it back with evidence saying, no, you're just trying to take advantage of us. And that's what we want to do, create a cadre of engaged citizens across all our communities that can work together and learn together to manage a future with rising seas in Miami-Dade County and global climate change for all of us. Thank you so much. It's been a true honor to be a part of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Xavier. That was such a great presentation, and thank you for sharing with us and reminding us how art can be such a powerful, really important tool in environmental protection. I think we don't give it its due. And
yeah,
thank
I
you.
agree with you on that. But let's change that. Let's change that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully starting today. So please, I'm going to open up the panel for questions now. We have some time. You can type those into the Q&A box. We do have one coming that's in already. But please, if you have questions for the panel, please type those in. And the first one comes from another one of our Wetlands Awards winners, from Wenley Ferguson. And it's directed to Kathy, but I think any of the panelists could probably address this. And I think Xavier has done so in his presentation. But what tools have you used to continue to engage community members when the fight continues and people can become disheartened? How do you keep people engaged?
Well, through education, as I mentioned earlier, education keeps people engaged, having people a part of this, but also, as you saw, I mentioned all the challenges that we had, but I also, at the end, like to focus on opportunities so that it doesn't seem so hopeless, and that keeps them engaged.
Yeah, for me, it's quite an easy vehicle for me because it's all about experiential learning. And remember, it was the volunteers creating the grids. It was the volunteers asking the store owners. There's a sense of ownership. It's their project, right? So I think that's one wonderful way of doing it. And the second thing is, I mean, Louis started us off. This is, I mean, and you can see in Kathy's work, this is not a parachute in project. I've been doing this for 15 years. They've been doing it for longer, but this is not like something that you just, stop and start. This is an ongoing effort. And you can also see that I change, right? Like I literally, if you look at the projects, they have little pieces of the other. So you adapt and you iterate and you bring others in, you create partners. You saw me with every library. So I think that's how you keep things engaged. You're also honest, you keep it real, but at the very, very, very most important thing is you give people hope, right? Like this is, I just told you how sad it's gonna be for Miami, but this is about hope. This is about making you understand that you have a role and you can do something. You can talk to your neighbor. You can plant a mangrove tree and sequester carbon, right? You can do something so it doesn't feel so hopeless. So I think as things get negative, you just keep on inspiring people and giving them hope and creating opportunities for them to feel like they're part of the process, because they are. They're literally the protagonists in this story.
Right. Louis, did you have any comments or anything you've learned from your project work? And
I would just agree with what the other panelists said. That thing about time is super important. And I think it's important that we have people who can be in communities that long. And it's one of the biggest critiques of academic work. We're often set to these arbitrary grant schedules of 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years at the longest. So it really hampers doing this type of work.
yeah, I think that's true. Getting the granting agencies to understand the this project needs to be sustainable over the long term. I had another question, and as we wait for any others to come in, I'm wondering, during this last year and a half, where we've all had to change the way we're working, but things keep moving, the threats are still there, right, Kathy? So have you learned anything that you're going to take forward with you, ways that you've engaged the community that might make the process better, or a new way that could improve the work?
It's always a continuing experience, which is why we like to bring in partners, which is why we had the science lecture series, because it's a continuous it continues, and you learn more. And I think that, as Xavier mentioned, this is our future. And we want to, and that's why it's so important for us to engage the students as well. But we have to look at what has happened in the past, because the photo I showed you of Rose Johnson, she was actually baptized in Turkey Creek. And a lot of this in these areas, a lot of this has to do with zoning. And that's one of the things that we're looking at, is changing the zoning. That's something that's new, because we realize this is going to continue unless the segregation era zoning that is still in place today, unless that zoning is changed. And we're really focusing on, and our officials don't like to be called out. We just had our mayor, when Turkey Creek was named one of the most 10 most endangered rivers in the nation, the mayor got offended and pulled Sharon Osbourne, what I call, don't you dare call me a racist. Well, the zoning was segregation era racist. I mean, it was during segregation era. The zoning is racist, and it needs to be changed. So that's a new approach that we're looking at. It's a true approach. It's timely, and if we change the zoning, I think that will help. But African Americans were relegated to living in certain areas, in high industrial areas. And unless we get the zoning updated, that is going to continue. So we always try to look for ways that we can do this. And hopefully, I am really hoping that the next generation will not have to deal with these same issues.
Miami has a similar but in reverse reality. The segregation wall in Miami, in Liberty City, is at one of the highest areas. That's where people didn't want to live. They actually wanted to live by the beach, right? Now the reverse is happening. The beach is flooding, and highland is in communities that had a fabric. Well, for a lot of reasons, sea level is the latest, gentrification the greatest. Those communities are starting to become unwoven. Overtown's the perfect example of that. There's a new movement. There's a resilience to try to bring Overtown Black, to make it that Black cultural center in Miami as it used to be before I-95 destroyed it. But when it comes to, so those are the issues now, like we're literally fighting that. And the residents who don't own in Liberty City but rent, some other property owner buys it. The renter now goes to cheaper housing, which is at the fringes. Those folks are going to suffer, if they get to buy in those areas. Everything's expensive right now, but in those areas will get flooded first and eventually will be abandoned before the higher ground areas. So that whole conversation that you're having about where people go and where markets and zoning move people is happening, I know, in every coastal community across the US. Regarding COVID though, and I don't mean to sound negative, but I'm happy, right? Not everyone's been vaccinated. People need to do that. But, the majority of Americans are moving that way. And, I think this president is leading us in the right direction, like his predecessor. But I'm really not happy with the way we responded to this pandemic. If you really think about it, we walked into this pandemic with two groups of people: those who could navigate through it, and those who needed to work through the pandemic and couldn't, have their food shipped in. They literally needed to go out and work. And that system hasn't really changed much. In fact, I thought there would be a new way of looking at nature, looking at the intersection between humans and wilderness, and what would happen about how the supply chain affected us, how agriculture, about how development and monocultures, all the stuff that we in this globalized economy reaching 8 billion people have created for ourselves. I thought that COVID was going to put a halt to this thing, and let's rethink how we do society. And I'm sorry, but it didn't. Our sea creatures got a reprieve for a few months, so they came closer to the shoreline, but it's business as usual again. The polluters pollute, the regulators have no teeth, and the systemic change that needs to happen so the systemic racism doesn't continue, and so that we don't continue literally destroying our ecosystems that will provide the ecosystem services that we need in a future. Those are all being obliterated. So that doesn't sound very hopeful. I understand that. But I want us to realize that something that big, I thought that we were going to turn the dime, right? Just like we did that, now we would do it with environment. I'm not seeing that happen with the speed I wanted. Some good positive things did come from COVID. For instance, I had to stop all of my face-to-face interactive engagement. So we created these virtual platforms on Instagram and stuff like that for folks to participate. Our entire homeowners group went on Zoom. You can see all our monthly meetings on our website. They're all recorded and posted. So there's some silver lining in this way. The projects are amplified and people can use this new technology. But what hasn't changed is the heart. What hasn't changed is the soul and the fabric of this nation. And I think we need to do a little bit more soul searching to find real equity, racial, social equity, because we're not there yet, not even close.
Oh, I guess just to build on that, I guess I'll think, not to go back to the funding agencies and the government, I think there needs to be more creativity how we think about funding environmental work. And not just on the part of government agencies, but also on the part of researchers. So, really thinking about creating research projects that truly involve the community, think about differently how we fund our questions. So researchers really need to become more creative in how we think about really addressing these issues. And think about other metrics besides just publishing and getting the next grant or funding a grad student. And then finally, for me, a story that I always like to share is that we do a lot of work in Southeast Raleigh, historically Black part of the city. And a lot of that work is funded by the Conservation Fund. And I'm not in the habit of like shouting out funders, but the Conservation Fund did an amazing job. They were funding us to start planning for an installation of a park. And when COVID hit, they allowed us to re-budget part of our grant to actually provide masks for our community members and to support the food bank in our local community. And it's that type of flexibility that I think we need to see from larger grant agencies such as the EPA, the NSF, and the NIH to really think about what are the needs that we see in these communities. Because we can't just focus on answering these often esoteric science-based research questions without considering the needs that are very much present in these communities. It's very exploitative and it's a bad way of doing business.
And it's counterintuitive, because if what you want to do is engage individuals in changing policy, because it is all about systemic change, then let's invest on those individuals being part of the problem solving. Let's literally invest in that effort. And that's hard to do. So for me, when I get a public art commission, I try to figure out how to have that community. It has nothing to do with what the call is about, but I just try to find ways of engage, or at least make it connect or relate. And sometimes those things are antithetical to one another, right? You want aesthetics, I want engagement. You're not getting funded on engagement. You were funded to paint a beautiful painting, but you have to figure out how to connect it too. So those are, I think those are, interesting discussions to have. And they're not just happening in the environmental world. I think they're happening all along. What I meant to say about the post-COVID thing is really take stock, of who we are as a species and what legacy we want to live. And more importantly, what do we want our great-grandchildren to be doing? I like, what air are they breathing? Are they living in a world of jellyfish and cockroaches because every other animal has gone extinct? I mean, like, what is it that we are doing with our lives today? How long can this greed consume and drive us? I know it's habitual, we've gotten used to it, but something has got to make us change and think about ecosystems and our interconnectedness to one another. And I'm using art. I'm trying to figure out what that vehicle is, but I promise you it's hard. It's really hard on all our sides. And we just have to keep on fighting. We can't give up.
Thank you for that. Really thoughtful answers to those questions. I just wanted to get in one comment that we got in and see if you have any quick reactions. But this is from one of the audience members, and just talking about the power of the community. And so the comment is, when working to build trust with community and being honest with them about how much power they truly have in terms of decision making, which is something I think you all talked about, even if the engaged citizens are not agency decision makers. Going on record with their concerns is very important. Under NEPA, impact analysis and review are required to address public concerns. So there is an opportunity to have a voice, and this is part of the power. Still, I wish we had more power to support and initiate enforcement actions. Any quick responses?
I agree with that comment, but I mean, metaphorically, it's late in the day.
Yeah.
There's no need to keep recording these responses. We know what's going on. So if we're not going to have change, how much are we really doing? And I realize the importance of our federal processes, and the comment process is incredibly important, but we need real change on the ground. And too often, there's an industry around supporting comments. I'm directly involved in that industry. There's an industry of doing science just to do science so we can provide better comments, but at the end of the day, not making any changes. And that's just not sustainable any longer.
Other thoughts?
Well, also, I will say that the change, communities are resilient and we're determined, and there are no limits. We were warned repeatedly about going up against a coal, a coal company when we had our what we call cold-blooded campaign. We were warned that we were going up against a powerful industry. I mean, our lives are at stake, and the lives of our children. So we're not going to be intimidated. And I don't see any limits, as long as you are protecting people and you are protecting property, there are no limits. You have to make your power. No one's going to give it to you, and you have to take it, and you have to grab it, and you have to demand it. And I know that, and then you also have to also expect sometimes you might not win all the battles, but it's important to keep fighting them, as long as you're confronted with them. We lost at the last level, but 2 weeks ago, we filed an appeal in Chancery Court for this 24-hour military staging operation. We lost the battle at MDEQ for permitting the world's largest wood pellet plant, but then they're proposing to build one in Bond, Mississippi, about 25 miles from Gulfport, we're going to oppose that. So we're not going to stop, and we will, we'll just demand accountability and demand to be heard.
I use a different vehicle. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I use a different vehicle, the vehicle of art, as a way of convening people and engaging them in conversations. So you could speak to someone who doesn't listen or doesn't let you be heard, or you can put a flag in front of your house and make a statement. You could speak to people who are the choir, or you could speak to a total stranger, your front door neighbor, who's never heard the news and needs to hear it from a trusted source, you, right? So I use art's elasticity, right? Because it is elastic here. I'm using a yard sign, I'm using a cup, right? I'm using art's elasticity to work across disciplines, to engage others, to bring the news to others, to activate, motivate others. And I think that's where I've decided to sort of, that's the lane I've decided to work in as a way of communicating. And the important thing is the process. We may not be successful, but as long as you're learning the skills and learning the issues by becoming involved in this campaign, you are building strength, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to build a movement, we're trying to rebuild a nation, right? We're trying to rebuild a society. So a lot of that society has fallen apart and been siloed. We're trying to bring it together. But that's not to say about the importance of law. I mean, I had a good opportunity to meet with Eric Forsman, who was a graduate student who fell in love with a spotted owl while he was guarding the gates to one of our national forests in Oregon, and did his research on the spotted owl, the research that was used to stop an entire industry from destroying the Pacific Northwest. I was there at a residency at a long-term ecological research site in Oregon, and I had the opportunity to interview him. And what he told, I was trying to inspire scientists by using him, scientist, as a model that others should emulate. And in all humility, he said, Xavier, it wasn't me, it was the lawyers. It was the lawyers who were able to make the difference. That's a hero, right? A hero who really made it happen, like a total hero, right? Eric Forsman. But the truth is that the only thing we can do as a democracy is make sure that those who govern listen. And if we can do that as an environmental movement, then we'll get everything back, right? And that's what we are charged to do. All of us using different tools, the tools that we have to make it happen. But at the end of the day, it's about courts, and it's about our executive branch, and it's about the legislative branch. It's about them ensuring that we don't subsidize fossil fuels and incentivize clean energy, that we keep our waters swimmable and fishable and drinkable, that we have clean air, not the fakeness of the last president talking about that we really do continue moving our society in the path that needs to happen. And we need democracy and engaged citizens to do that. So I celebrate ELI because I know that's literally what they do. That's what they've been doing. And again, I'm just so honored to be part of this effort.
Well, thank you all for your presentations and your thoughtful questions, and most importantly, for the work that you're doing. We had one last comment I just want to read because it sums it up well. Thank you all for your community improvement, wetland protection enhancement, and environmental education efforts. All of this work has to be integrated, as you are doing, to bring about positive change for all. It is truly inspirational, and I couldn't agree more. So thank you again. And congratulations to all our winners. Chandler, do you have any final remarks?
I just want to say thank you so much to our audience for joining us today, and for your many thought-provoking questions. We hope you'll continue to watch this space in years ahead. And an enormous, enormous thank you to our panelists. We just so appreciate your many contributions to today's program. Thank you all again. Please take care and stay safe. This was truly a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.